Welcome to Missing Middle Housing Solutions in Ohio Communities. I'm your host, Nicole Ware, Senior Associate State Director of Advocacy and Community Engagement for AARP Ohio. I lead the local advocacy and community outreach efforts in Southwest Ohio. I know that many of you are joining us from across the state, and we always like to see from where you're joining. So if you would please put in the chat what city you're joining from today. Cincinnati. That's where I'm from. Welcome. Fairfield, Youngstown, Cincy, Marysville, Hamilton. There we go. Cleveland, great. Columbus, Toledo. Good to see you all joining us here today from around the state. You can keep those coming as well. So again, we appreciate you joining us today. Before we begin, I'd like to walk you through how to engage with us during our time together. So move your mouse or cursor across the bottom of your device to reveal the Q&A icon. Near the end of the event, there will be a time to ask questions, so be sure to enter your questions in the Q&A icon so that we can isolate your question and eliminate the need to scroll through the chat to find them. Of course, if you have a comment, feel free to put that in chat. So we are also recording this presentation. In the coming days, you'll be able to view it on AARP Ohio's YouTube page, and we will put that link in the chat for you. AARP has been working to promote the health and well-being of older Americans for 66 years. I'm here on behalf of some 1.4 million members right here in Ohio. It's a lot of people with a lot of opinions. And what we know is when we surveyed them that over 75% of Ohioans age 45 or older believe it's important to have affordable housing options in their community. And here lies the problem. Across the United States, there is a shortage of available mid-sized, moderately priced homes. The nation is missing and needs more housing options that exist between single-family homes and large apartment buildings. A critical part of the solution is called missing middle housing or middle housing. Middle housing consists of duplexes, triplexes, small apartment communities, and middle housing provides the size and affordability options that people of all ages, including older adults, need, but have difficulty finding because very few have been built in the US since the early 1940s. The shortage is largely due to zoning constraints and the shift to car-centric patterns of development, among other reasons. Since middle housing is house scale, the design and size of the buildings fit comfortably among single-family houses, thereby preserving the area's look and feel. Perhaps you didn't even notice older middle housing that is already in your community because they blend in so well. AARP Ohio has been collaborating with communities large and small to support zoning changes that expand housing options that allow people of all ages to age in their homes and in their communities. AARP Ohio has supported the City of Cincinnati's new Connected Communities zoning ordinance that allows middle housing to be built. And we're pleased to support the City of Xenia by providing the technical assistance through Opticos Design, one of our speakers today. Our most recent collaboration is with the City of Columbus via this informative webinar. And you'll hear from leaders of the latter two communities later in the program. After this event, AARP will email you a link to an introductory guide and legislative guides on local and state missing middle housing regulations. And we'll also put that link in chat. There you can download an introductory guide to discovering and developing missing middle housing, a photo-filled 36-page publication created by AARP and Opticos Design, our guest speaker today, and the firm that popularized the phrase missing middle housing. For elected officials and city planners, you'll want to download a legislative guide to re-legalizing middle housing, a model act and guide to statewide legislation, and expanding middle housing options, a guide to local middle housing regulations. 2 free guides that state and local governments can use when drafting legislation to permit missing middle housing. Again, aarp.org/missing middle housing. You'll find these resources, videos, articles, and additional resources. We'll put that link in the chat. Now, I'd like to familiarize you with our speakers. Jennifer Settle is a senior associate at Opticos Design and leads their newly established Chicago office. She brings over 15 years of experience in transforming the built environment to enhance people's everyday lives. In her career, she's led numerous community design charrettes and played a critical role in neighborhood, city, and regional master planning projects. These visions form the basis for innovative, comprehensive, and zoning plan overhauls, as well as the future build out of important development sites. She hosts the unique ability to craft projects from broad scale thinking to concrete built form. Jennifer advocates for intentional communities and neighborhoods to provide diverse housing choices, closely collaborating with cities to better calibrate their regulations to enable missing middle housing. Before rejoining Opticos in 2022, she led zoning code update for the city of South Bend, winner of the 2021 Richard Driehaus Forum-Based Code Award. Under her direction, the Chicago team of Opticos recently completed a missing middle housing study for Asheville, North Carolina, and a zoning code update for the mixed-use corridors of Columbus, Ohio. Our second speaker is Erin Prosser. She is the Deputy Director of Housing Strategies for the City of Columbus, and she brings nearly 2 decades of public and private sector experience leading the planning, developing, and engagement of numerous high-profile projects. She most recently served as the Director of Community Development in the Department of Planning, Architecture, and Real Estate at The Ohio State University, where she oversaw the revitalization of Wyland Park, including the addition of nearly 500 affordable housing units and the 7.5-acre redevelopment of the 15th Avenue and High Street intersection. Prior to her time with the university, she worked as a planner at MKSK Studios, a multidisciplinary design and planning firm, and served as a planner for Franklin County's Economic and Planning Department. She holds a master's degree in city and regional planning from The Ohio State University and a bachelor's degree in philosophy from Bowling Green State University. And last but not least is Brian Forshner. Brian is an AICP certified planner with 25 years of experience in the public and private sectors. For the past 14 years, Brian has been the city planner for the city of Xenia, an age-friendly community of 26,000 in Southwest Ohio, 30 minutes east of Dayton. Xenia is a unique historic city that contains a hub of 5 regional bike trails. Xenia is experiencing significant new housing growth and investment, fueled in part by its proximity to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Brian recently led Next Plan, Xenia's new community-based comprehensive plan, and partnered with Jennifer Settle of Opticos and the Congress for New Urbanism to produce the Hub District Vision and Implementation Plan. Both efforts have captured and channeled a community drive to encourage missing middle housing as a way to reinvigorate older neighborhoods and improve the quality, diversity, and affordability of Xenia's housing option. Our first presenter is Jennifer Settle. Jennifer, take it away.
Good morning, everybody. Sure everybody can see that okay? All good? Thank you so much for having me here today. We are always grateful to the AARP, and thanks to Nicole for that wonderful introduction. But really, AARP plays such an incredible role in advocating for more livable communities, and we're grateful for the work that they do. As Nicole mentioned, Opticos Design is a group of urban designers, architects, and strategists that are really passionate about enabling vibrant, diverse neighborhoods. And we focus much of our work across the country on what we call missing middle housing. Middle housing includes a range of house scale buildings that just so happen to have multiple units inside of them. Opticos coined the term middle housing or missing middle in 2010 and wrote the book on the topic in 2020. This conversation today is primarily about enabling more housing choices. Missing middle includes a range of housing types, like the duplex, a cottage court, a fourplex, or a courtyard apartment. I know before I could have told you what missing middle really meant, I lived in many of these types, from a backyard garage apartment in California to a courtyard building in Chicago. It was what I could afford at the time that was close enough to walk to work or to take transit. It's this variety of housing that provides the needed choices to meet people at different stages of life, different income levels, and different interests in communities. The goal of today's presentation is really to provide you with the language on what is and what is not missing middle. We'll start with a conversation about why we need to prioritize this type, and then later look at some common barriers and some solutions that hopefully provide you tools to enable this type of housing in your own community. We'll end with those exemplar examples from Ohio communities of Xenia and Columbus, and then we'll have lots of time for questions. So before I get into the characteristics and the types that we include with middle housing, I want to highlight some of the reasons why this variety of housing is so important to prioritize and why we need to have this conversation today. We know that housing markets of every size and shape are really seeing some unprecedented shifts. 1/3 of our households are now single persons. 50 years ago, only 1 out of every 10 people lived alone. Today, it's 1 on 3. That is a monumental shift. The next one always sort of gets me. By 2025, 75 to 85% of households will not have children in it. We need to be thinking differently about the standard housing that we're providing. And the last one I want to highlight is that by 2030, 1 in every 5 people in the US will be over 65. This is precisely why AARP is so involved in this conversation about housing. In Ohio, 1 out of every 9 households have someone older than 65 today. We need to be asking ourselves, what does this demographic group want, right? Smaller homes, single story, less yards and maintenance, a sense of security, and potentially less car dependence. At the same time those demographics are shifting, there's this tremendous mismatch between what the market wants and what we've been providing over the course of the last 30 or even 40 years. There's a growing demand for housing types that are more walkable and urban, and this is primarily driven by 2 groups, right? Nearly 60% of millennials and 30% of baby boomers are looking for those smaller middle housing types. And they're looking for them in places where they can walk to work, walk to the grocery store or school, or to get a cup of coffee. Why do we call it missing? Well, we know that less than 15% of all housing units produced in the last couple decades were middle scale. So for the purpose of this graph, we mean buildings that house between 2 and 19 units. There are many reasons why we've seen these declines, right? Including restrictive zoning and covenants, as well as incentives that promote the single unit house, and often development in more suburban locations. Across Ohio, 74% of existing housing is in single family homes. There's this pent up demand for all these other types, but we just don't have the supply. And it's this singularity of housing choices that's become a big part of the housing crisis, right? As it gets harder and harder to afford that single family house. The affordable housing crisis has really touched almost every community in our country, urban and suburban both. Over 30% of American households are cost burdened. If you add transportation costs to that, the figures look closer to 50%, which is really scary, right? And it's not just a lack of housing for people with lower incomes, but also now for the middle class. In Ohio, over 44% of renters are cost burdened and 20% of homeowners. This doesn't affect everybody equally. Typical solutions to this need for more affordable housing often includes two strategies. The first on the left, subsidized housing, which really focuses on helping the lowest incomes under that 60% annual median income. Or we can talk about increasing the supply of housing of all kinds, right? But in our country, both solutions tend to focus on this type of bigger products. These can certainly be really effective solutions when located appropriately, but we also need more attainable housing choices that better fit into our existing neighborhoods. The places that people tend to gravitate towards and love tend to be more human scales. Those under those 3 stories with places to interact at that street level, right? Where shops are closer to houses, or in environments where you can walk. We used to know how to deliver more housing within our neighborhoods. This is, of course, a Sears catalog from the 1920s, where you could actually buy these stock homes, including things like a fourplex, order it, get it shipped to your nearest railroad station, hire a contractor to pick it up and build the kit. Pretty amazing. And they fit on regular sized neighborhood lots, right? This is really important piece of what made these work. You can see these arrows in the bottom right that point to the lot width that these buildings belonged on, right? They were located throughout your typical residential neighborhood. Shortly after most of those were built in the early 30s or 40s, zoning was put in place. And most of our cities started regulating by use, which drew lines across our cities designating larger swaths of land for single-family housing only. The hard reality is that there are discriminatory underpinnings to a lot of that policy that we need to acknowledge and start to undo. But with that zoning, much of our cities became exclusionary, meaning they were only available for those that could afford that single family house. Most of our major cities like Cincinnati and Columbus in Ohio have over 70% of their city that only allows single unit development. And most of your suburban communities are even higher. These patterns of zoning and developing are simply not sustainable. Creating more walkable environments with housing near services and amenities is really becoming an imperative for both the environmental and economic reasons. The big takeaway is that there's this need to accommodate more housing and better meet the needs of people living and working in Ohio. You're seeing a growing percentage of singles and senior households, and we need housing choices that better meet those changing demographics. We're seeing a growing percentage, or we're losing our starter homes, right? A growing percentage of renters that are severely cost burden, and we need housing choices that match those changing needs. All right, so let's dive more into the important characteristics and type of middle housing. We want to be really clear here. It isn't just about allowing medium density or multifamily housing. Once again, these are house scale buildings with multiple units in walkable or established neighborhoods. Over the course of the last 80 years, we've really set up our financial systems, our planning, our policy, and our development industry with single family detached houses in mind, everything over here on the left. But in the last couple decades, we've started to create systems to deliver that bigger scale of housing that's over here on the right and make it economically viable. But for all these types in the middle, we really don't have the systems in place to deliver them easily. I want to be clear, the most important factor of middle housing is that they're compatible with that scale and form of a house. It shouldn't just be about getting more units on a lot. The form is a really critical part of missing middle. This is an example of a triplex, right? 3 units built to look like a single family house. The second part is that they're more affordable to middle income households. We often call this affordable by design. And when we say that, we mean they're designed to work on your typical infill lots and use smaller units and buildings that can help lower the land cost and be built incrementally over time. I want to be clear, missing middle is not a guarantee of affordability, right? We've really started to use 3 criteria for evaluating the results of this work. First, is it feasible, right? It has to make economic sense for developers and builders to build it. 2, is it attainable? Are the homes that are being produced being delivered at a size and a type that can achieve attainable price points in your market, right? And finally, are these types offering quality living and contributing to a place that's desirable to live? When implemented thoughtfully, middle housing can increase rental options through small scale multifamily housing, can offer smaller, more attainable starter homes, as well as add units on existing lots to help offset some housing costs for existing homeowners, or provide multi generational living opportunities for aging residents. This variety of housing can meet those demographic shifts while also enabling small scale infill that supports local businesses and promotes more compact, walkable communities. All right, let's quickly review the building types that we generally include in Missing Middle. I want to start with this palette of missing middle types. There's this range from small, medium to large, and not all of these types will be appropriate in every neighborhood or every community. So as we go through these types, I want you to be thinking about which ones make sense in your city or town and where they might fit in different locations that you have. Before I start running through all the types, I want to call your attention to the yellow box in this right corner that starts to identify the lot size that these work best on, as well as the resultant density. Density is a really bad metric for measuring what you're actually going to get, right? It's a little bit unpredictable. But I want to show you that we're achieving surprisingly high densities while maintaining that 2.5-story house scale building. So starting with the stacked duplex, this is a two units on top of each other. And you can see that this density is already starting to hit the limits that we often find in many cities' multifamily standards, right? That typically max out about 12 dwelling units per acre. But this housing looks like a single family house. We have the side-by-side version with a shared wall where the owner can often rent the second unit to generate income or use it to provide housing for a family member. In either configuration of a duplex, it's important that it fits on your typical single lot and maintains that rear yard. Next type, cottage courts are made up of a few or more small detached homes oriented around a shared court. These are quickly becoming a highly sought after housing type for downsizing boomers, first-time homebuyers, and single-person households who want that smaller detached home, but maybe less of the yard maintenance. These are illegal to build in most US cities, right? Why? Fortunately, in our work, we found some innovative developers that are willing to stick out that zoning process and prove the success of these housing types. This is an example of a for sale cottage court with 12 total units organized around a shared community green. This project was located in one of the more expensive markets in the country, but they were able to reduce that sales cost from that typical $500 a square foot for a single family house in this community to about $300. Still very expensive, but significantly less than that status quo. Next, townhouses represent one of the largest growing types of new housing built in the last decade. It's really appealing to developers because they can be financed with a conventional single-family mortgage and sold as a fee simple lot. We do have to be careful when allowing townhouses. While they're adding to the supply, we're finding that they're not necessarily delivering on that attainability and can often result in some problematic forms. So we want to avoid two big things when we start to encourage townhouses. First, in the upper left, what we call slot homes that don't preserve the livability of the units in terms of light and air and don't fit into a neighborhood because of their size and that depth that takes up that whole depth of the lot and doesn't have that rear yard. Second, the tuck under type in the bottom right is a really efficient and definitely adding to the housing choice. But if you allow this tuck under parking to dominate the street with all those garages, it's not creating good walkable environments, right? So we want to think about how we can allow these attached types in a way that might better enhance both their attainability as well as improve that streetscape and public realm. The next type I'll highlight is one we really need to start enabling, right? A triplex or a fourplex starts to take the shape of that grander house, but contains 3 or 4 smaller units. Few of these have been built recently due to many code and financing obstacles. Once you pass that 3 units or more threshold, you're now working with a much stricter building code and you have to use commercial financing. We talk a lot about fourplexes because they still fit within that house scale and neighborhood fabric, right? We're talking about 4 smaller units within the same building footprint as a typical house. So you can see in this great example from a mid-sized town in Indiana that we were just working in, how 2 fourplexes, those little white boxes, can be the similar footprint as surrounding homes and fit on the same size lot as a single family house. These are both of these have 4 2-bedroom, 1 bath units in each of them. And it's a really great type of unit that fits, those demographic shifts of 1 and 2 person households that we saw earlier. A medium-sized multiplex can have 5 to 8 units. The key here is still that scale. We're below that 3 stories and sticking with that residential house character. As we move up in intensity, we have a larger multiplex, often with up to 12 or even 16 or 18 units. These start to jump in height and scale. So we typically want to differentiate these as upper missing middle housing and be careful about where they might be allowed in our communities. These often work really well on a little bit bigger streets or corridors, or as a transition between your main street or downtown and your lower intensity neighborhoods. Again, getting bigger courtyard apartments can provide a lot of units and that really great community and shared space that allows for some wonderful landscaping and trees. Finally, I want to mention accessory dwelling units. These are often called carriage houses or granny flats or in-law units. These can be detached or attached to the main house. The key thing with these is that they should be allowed by right. The reality is that these are very expensive to build on a cost per square foot basis. So it's important to enable them in addition to other middle housing types as well. But ADUs are really a good first step to add that gentle density and smaller housing choices into your community. When we look at this full spectrum of types, each has an intended form and scale, which is really important to consider when you're thinking about allowing middle housing that fits the different context of your city or town. These types have existed historically in cities across the country, right? From Michigan to my hometown in Chicago. This one in the middle is in my neighborhood, to places as unique as New Orleans. Everywhere we go, we find a similar catalog of building types adapted to local climate and culture. The styles can be different, but the types are pretty much the same. And unless you're really looking closely at water meters or mailboxes, they're embedded into predominantly single-family neighborhoods without really standing out. Ohio has many, many great examples in both your largest cities and your small towns. We want to learn from these types and protect these naturally occurring housing options and start enabling them to be built again. In sum, these types all share some important characteristics that we need to be thinking about when regulating or advocating for missing middle. So I'm going to run through what we've found to be the most important characteristics of middle housing. First, these types perform best when they're located in a more walkable context. People are willing to make trade-offs on space or parking in order to live in a great neighborhood. This does not have to mean downtown or Main Street, right? Creating a gentle increase in density does play an important role in supporting local services and mobility choices. Missing middle can go a long way in helping keep those small neighborhood businesses and downtowns viable, but it's really about gradual change, right? As we build more housing, it opens up opportunities to incrementally add amenities and vice versa. As we add more amenities, our neighborhoods become more attractive and can fill that demand for new housing. The solution is truly twofold. Walkable neighborhoods are really, really good for supporting our local main streets. And our main streets are a really important part of providing housing units that keep people in our community. Again, the most important factor of middle housing is that they're compatible with the scale and form of a house. We are talking about both the width, depth, and height of the building. Most middle housing is under that 2.5 stories. So if we think about the same size box on a standard infill lot, it might have one big house, it could have 2, 3, or even 4 smaller units inside of it. This allows for that adaptability to meet those changing household needs. Along the same lines, missing middle housing offers well-designed smaller units. We aren't talking about the size of a tiny house necessarily, but the sweet spot is really that 1 to 2 bedroom unit that responds to those demographic shifts. So if you look around your community today or go on Zillow, how many 1,000 square foot units are on the market, right? Probably not as many as a house. Parking is often one of the concerns and one of the barriers that come up in our missing middle work. It often seems like we're actually better at housing cars than people. When implementing missing middle in walkable or older neighborhoods, there are really just physical constraints that limit the amount of parking that's achievable on a lot. All that space we're dedicating to parking gets expensive, and the costs to provide it are being passed directly on to the renter or the buyer. Next, a key characteristic of middle housing is its ability to support that sense of community, both within the building itself and in the neighborhood. One of the really unique distinctions of middle housing is that it creates that sense of community, right? Often providing shared spaces internally and outside. I think this is a really important aspect given the growing number of seniors and single person households that still want to be part of a community, but live somewhere that feels like their own. And finally, because of that focus on smaller units in a house scale product, missing middle can be built with the same simple construction methods and often the same financing as your typical house. This means that both smaller developers and local trades, electricians, plumbers, carpenters, can execute them, right? When we talk about the affordable of middle housing, we aren't talking about capital A affordable subsidized housing necessarily, but missing middle typically targets that 80% to 120% annual median income. It's about providing options that are more attainable relative to that new single family house or townhouse. Just as important as understanding the characteristics that make middle housing successful, we also want to identify the barriers that prevent it from getting built. Unfortunately, the list can get pretty long. I'm not going to go into all of these in detail, but these are the barriers we see most common. Our zoning codes are often non-starters for new types of housing. There's a severe lack of districts and zoning districts that enable missing middle housing. And even when you have zoning that might allow small multifamily as a use, we typically find other regulations like lot width or lot area that make them impractical to build. 2, our development and financial industries aren't always aligned or familiar with some of these new products. 3, our building codes, hugely important, but they often place unintended cost on smaller projects. This can include things like sprinklers or elevators, or even your basic sewer and water tap fees. These items can all add up when you can't spread these extra costs over many, many units. And finally, we often see neighborhood resistance to multifamily housing of any kind. It takes some hard conversations to really work through some of those misconceptions and fear that can exist around multifamily or even rental housing options. In our work, we have learned to frame the conversation away from trigger terms like density or upzoning or even multifamily, and find more success in talking through the more important factors like form, housing types, and the people that want or need these housing choices. We like to make the point that zoning is a 100-year-old operating system. right? It was conceived in the same year that this old camera on the left was developed. This is definitely not how most of us take pictures anymore. So why are we using the same outdated models to regulate what happens to our cities? We are way overdue to think that system, and it's really becoming an economic imperative for our cities to allow more housing to be built. All right, I promise I'll keep this brief, but I know people's eyes start to glaze over when I talk about zoning. But I do want to highlight the top 5 barriers in zoning that we often find in most local ordinances. Starting with currently, the majority of our cities are zoned to prevent middle housing. All this pink is limited to single-family houses only. So this first planning barrier is just that missing middle is not easily classified based in our existing systems, right? Our systems are based on use. And when you look at zoning tables, right, you all have one in your community, we often find the first barrier is that multi-unit housing are just not allowed, right? Or they require a much more onerous process. This is sort of the extreme example from a local Midwest town that we worked in, where we found that they only had one multifamily zone, this R5, and that it did not actually allow any multi-unit buildings by right. They had 6 residential zoning districts across the town, and all of them allowed and encouraged a single family house. They did allow ADUs and condos as special use, but that required 3 public meetings and a much lengthier and discretionary review process, right? Unfortunately, this is fairly typical in many cities. Next, let's talk a little bit about density, right? Density can be helpful in some cases, but when it comes to regulating the built environment, it's a really imperfect metric. Middle housing types look like a detached home in both their size and scale, but they can often have surprisingly high densities. So in this example shown here, the building on the left is a 3-story apartment, and the one on the right is a house-scaled 5-plex, right? Both building types are very different in form and scale, but because of the unit count and the lot size, they have very similar densities. So if a jurisdiction is regulating with a maximum density limits, it leads to really unpredictable built outcomes, but it also unintendedly prevents a wide range of middle housing options from being embedded in your housing stock. Regulating the actual building mass or the envelope of the building is a much more effective way to get these house scale multi-unit buildings. Many jurisdictions also set minimum lot areas for different types of development, which is often not at all based on the existing lot dimensions that you have in your community. A recent example was from a city in Kansas, where we looked at their regulations required a minimum of a 50-foot wide by 100-foot minimum lot, which equaled to about a 75,000 per unit. And when we looked at most of the surrounding neighborhoods, they were made up of these 40-foot by 100-foot deep lots, much smaller, right? So they weren't actually even allowing the loved products that were in the neighborhoods that existed today. Regulating lot width is a much more effective tool than lot size or lot area, but you need to be careful that you aren't requiring this consolidation of multiple lots in order to make a parcel even buildable. Another common barrier seen in zoning codes is our setback or our open space requirements haven't been calibrated to those existing lot sizes that you have on the ground in your community. Similarly, as lot area, these often make smaller lots impossible to develop in a feasible manner, right? So this was an example where their density, a community we just worked in, where their density actually allowed 18 units per acre. Seemed pretty good for middle housing, right? But their setbacks were so large for their typical infill lots, they actually prevented any building from getting built, right? We want to be thinking about what are those building types that fit on your existing lots and calibrating our regulations accordingly. Finally, high off-street parking requirements present another barrier to middle housing. This diagram demonstrates the impact of adding just one more parking space per unit related to how much land is actually needed to fit in with that building, right? High parking standards often prevent many types of middle housing from being built, especially in smaller infill situations. There are several other standards to keep in mind when evaluating your zoning for barriers, but the takeaway is that we've written most of these rules to incentivize the single-family house, and we need to start to equal the playing field to make middle housing more attractive for developers and housing providers to build it. In addition to zoning, I want to mention the building code also plays a major role in limiting what gets built. The International Residential Building Code only allows up to 2 units in a building under their standards, right? Before you have to jump to that more expensive and complicated International Building Code. But some states like North Carolina or the cities like Memphis, Tennessee, have started to address this barrier by changing local or state building code to actually allow up to 4 or 6 units to be built under the residential standards, as opposed to requiring that more expensive IBC. This can go a long way, right, in bringing these housing types into our market and making them more attainable. We really need those new systems across several sectors to start to deliver these types, from financing and entitlement to marketing and even real estate education around the topic. Removing those barriers and fixing our zoning is that first step in the process to help build an industry, housing industry that supports middle housing. But I want to be clear, zoning is not a silver bullet to new development. We also need to keep taking steps to go further, fix our financing systems, recruit and train new developers and housing providers, and take that next step in your community to build this new industry and system of delivering housing. All right, shifting gears a little bit to the more positive part, I want to highlight a few case studies that really emphasize the range of ways that cities and communities are implementing missing middle housing. The first one is a community just southwest of Omaha, Nebraska, with a population of about 25,000. This project looks to bring over 700 units on 50 acres of vacant land. But rather than one large multifamily complex, it's delivering it as a neighborhood made up of smaller middle housing building types, including townhouses and live works, carriage houses, and a combination of up to 8-unit buildings. This is a suburban area, and it's a greenfield site with a high rate of families and high ownership levels, but they had a growing need for more rental options, right? So this developer typically did large garden-style suburban apartment complexes, but he came to us and said, I want to do something different. I want to deliver a neighborhood, right? And you can see the different number of units in each buildings here. One of the things that makes this project successful that I think is really important to talk about is how the developer approached parking. In order to create that sense of community and those quality open spaces, he recognized that he couldn't have big areas of parking or just tuck under garages while still providing a great streetscape and open spaces, right? So even though this is a suburban location and people definitely needed their cars, he took an approach that every unit had just one garage spot and the rest was on street. People were very, very skeptical of this approach, but it's really been a success even in this very auto-oriented location. And the city and the developer are both really proud that they're able to deliver a choice of new units at different price points that did not exist in this community previously, right? This was entirely rental products. This project has dramatically shifted the conversation about what multifamily housing can look like. Notably, this project would not have been able to be achieved if the city hadn't first made sure that their development standards allowed it. We're going to hear about some great examples of jurisdictions in Ohio doing this work, but the second case study I want to highlight is in South Bend, Indiana. The city recognized that their current ordinance was not achieving its community's desired goals of walkable neighborhoods or diverse housing. So they set out on a course of neighborhood planning followed by small amendments to their zoning code that would better encourage neighborhood infill. They also took key steps along the way to start to eliminate off-street parking mandates, allow accessory dwelling units by right, and calibrate their existing regulations to their local conditions, particularly studying that lot width to understand what missing middle building types could be achieved. After making these changes to their zoning in the first 18 months after adoption, the city saw a jump in approved projects, while the annual number of rezonings, special exceptions, and variance requests dropped by 66%. South Bend, though, has a weak market, right? Land values are pretty low, and they have a lot of vacant infill parcels. So the zoning code removed the existing regulatory barriers, but the cost to appraise new units and build them was still really tough to pencil out. So the city continues to look at really innovative ways of lowering the cost to deliver these new types of housing. They're now offering pre-approved building plans for types like cottages, carriage houses, duplexes, and even a sixplex, as well as a tax abatement program for new home construction citywide, and a program that helps cover sewer hookups for new infill housing. These incentives have been a really key step in encouraging smaller and nonprofit developers to add these middle housing types to their portfolio. There's also been a tremendous effort to build up and train a group of local small developers who now meet regularly to share in that progress of lessons learned as more and more middle housing gets built. Just recently, the City Council approved a developer's petition to do a scattered site development on 37 lots using the pre-approved plans and LIHTC funding. South Bend continues to chip away at the barriers and create that new system, and they're seeing the results. Both for-profit and nonprofit builders are broadening the types of products that are being delivered. To wrap things up, let's talk a little bit more about where you can begin, right? How can you start to encourage your community to take that first step? No matter which path you take to enable middle housing, it all really starts with effectively advocating, right? Talking about what is the need and who is this housing serving. Start identifying those demographic shifts in your community and have the conversation about how housing can better respond. A lot of our work with AARP allows us to do really fun walking tours, right? These can be a really effective way to start that conversation. We encourage you to take your local leaders and housing providers or neighborhood groups on a tour through a neighborhood that has some middle housing. These can be a way of really helping people see how this mix of densities are already working in your predominantly single-family neighborhoods and help take some away that fear and misconceptions, or ask the questions, right, about what housing might fit in your neighborhoods. This was an example from a recent AARP engagement in Bismarck, North Dakota, where we went on about a mile and a half walk through one of their neighborhoods, and people were shocked to find that these buildings existed in their neighborhoods without really standing out. Find that local partner to help support these efforts, like middle housing presentations or walking tours or community workshops, and start building a community that supports housing and advocating for housing that meets the needs of your population, right? Your local AARP chapter is a great place to start. As Nicole mentioned at the start and in the chat, they've created many amazing resources, but also you can find other groups to help build this community that supports housing, from your National Home Builders Association to other nonprofits that are already working in and around your community. The next step after starting that community of advocacy is really looking closely at your policies and zoning to see which regulations or processes are preventing or discouraging middle housing. look at your comp plan, to your neighborhood plans, and your zoning, right? We know it only takes one standard to prevent middle housing from getting built, so it's really key to understand where those barriers are. One of the ways that we use to understand those barriers is to test zoning both graphically and financially. So we look at different development scenarios using real or typical size lots to see what the current zoning is allowing, right? And often we find that zoning is encouraging only that single family, but often allowing a structure which may be built that's not really in line with the neighborhood character. The last step here on this slide is really looking at what middle housing types would fit on the lot and starting to reverse engineer those standards. Right? So in this city, by allowing more units and refining the height to 2.5 stories, they could provide 3 units that were starting to provide that attainable price point relative to the single family home that they were currently encouraging. Those steps of education and diagnosing your zoning are key in building that support for effective zoning changes. Zoning should be calibrated to your particular place and to your community's needs. We need to reset our zoning to provide and focus on regulations that are objective and predictable to all users, right? This can start really small with targeted fixes and build over time to start chipping away at those barriers and creating the systems or the tools to deliver middle housing while still ensuring those good design outcomes. Zoning should first and foremost make it clear what scale of multifamily is intended. This house scale building on the left has a very different impact on the neighborhood and the walkability than this much larger block scale building on the right, even though they're both classified as multifamily. Right? It's important to start to differentiate in your zoning between these two possible outcomes. Zoning reform, of course, can take many different scales, right? You can start with a specific neighborhood or a smaller site, or focus on key corridors or a set of places in your community where this type of housing might be more comfortable or readily welcomed. Or you can create systems or new standards that apply to your citywide, right? It's important to give some thought to what resources, what capacity, and what will your community has to do this work, right? It's okay to start small. If you're not ready to make zoning changes, start to think about what steps you can take to build that broader community support and understanding. We often do missing middle focused housing studies that start to set the stage for future change. These can often be incorporated at a higher policy level, such as a part of your comp plan update. We'll hear from Xenia, Ohio, that did just that. Similarly, pilot projects are a really effective way to start to test potential zoning changes before applying them more broadly. You can also look at specific sites to help visualize opportunities and build that support for middle housing without changing all your rules yet, right? This bottom right is an example of a city-owned property in the city of Kalamazoo, Michigan, where the city provided that gap financing to build a duplex and a carriage house in partnership with a local nonprofit housing developer with the goal of supporting zoning changes that are now underway. There is truly no one-size-fits-all approach, but it is clear that cities need to be thinking about how they can take that next step to providing more housing choices. To wrap things up, I want to bring it back to the work already being done in your state, right? Your 3 largest cities are all currently tackling zoning in very different ways. These are great models to look at the various ways that you can start to make change, right? Cincinnati's Connected Communities are packaging a set of zoning and land use policy reforms. Cleveland is zoning a reform plan, has a zoning reform plan that focuses on 4 form-based code pilot programs. And of course, Columbus Zonin Code Update is taking a phased approach to tackling the demand for new housing capacity and affordability. many more small towns and suburban communities are also making moves to modify their zoning and allow more housing types. So today we're going to get a lot of insight into what the city of Columbus is currently doing. Opticos has been thrilled to work with the city for the last 2 years to update their zoning. And they're taking a really methodical, thoughtful, and phased approach that started over 2 years ago with a code diagnosis to identify the barriers to new development. And then it followed that with a robust analysis of the different place types that existed in and around their community, right? Understanding what was on the ground and what were the opportunities, as well as an understanding and study into the demand for new housing units. Phase 1 of the zoning code that was just adopted focused on the mixed use corridors. It was really about meeting this demand and creating tools that could offer that supply, right? And get that supply built more quickly and affordably. Phase 2 is then looking at the rest of the city, including how middle housing can offer more housing diversity in the neighborhoods, right? These two things go hand in hand, right? That supply and that choice. And so I'm going to turn it over now to Aaron Prosser, Director of Housing Strategies in Columbus, who has really led much of the engagement and education around the housing needs that face Columbus today. So really excited to have her talk a little bit more about the city's efforts there.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you, AARP, for letting me join this morning. We have been on a number of year journey here in Columbus with really understanding the impacts to the growth that we're seeing in Central Ohio, and what does it mean to respond in a way that allows for continued opportunity for our residents and a growth pattern that ensures our quality of life. And what does that look like for a growing city in the Midwest? And we have really amazing partners like Opticos and Jennifer in particular, as we go through this journey and understanding what does it mean for our community to respond to our housing needs. And what we do want to focus on in Columbus and in Central Ohio is what we mean by affordable housing. And what we mean is that there are affordable options throughout our region. We want to make sure that regardless of your income, if you're a teacher in our community or a very important doctor at one of our hospitals, you have choices and affordable options throughout the region. We also want to make sure that it's stable housing that meets families' needs. If it's affordable to you, but you're doubled up with your sister's family, that is not going to meet our expectations for affordable housing for families here in Central Ohio. And finally, we want to always be mindful that home ownership is the primary way we build wealth in this community, and the opportunity for us to expand opportunities for community families to build wealth through home ownership is also really important. We have a housing strategy. One of those components is focusing on our zoning code and our overall development review process. And as we talk about affordability, I think sometimes it is a little overwhelming to think of how we can do that in our communities. And the way we break it down and the way we look at our solutions is we look at affordability by supply. And as Jennifer mentioned, we spent the last couple of years working with the team to identify opportunities along our corridors to really bolster that supply. We have a lot of folks joining us here in Central Ohio, and we don't have enough housing, and we're not keeping pace on that housing construction. So every year that we add more folks and we don't add that housing, we see our prices escalate. We see less opportunity for lower income families near opportunities to be able to afford housing. And so we really worked in that phase 1 on the zoning code on supply and making sure that along those corridors with access to transit and proximity to our job centers, that we had enough housing to support the growing community. The second piece is that affordability by design, which has been really well summarized by Jennifer over the last few minutes, just understanding what that, looking at a diversity of housing types can do for your community. What are the smaller scale types of housings that allow for that natural affordability to occur in our community? And I'll talk a little bit about what that looks like for us in Columbus. And then finally, we do work really hard to make sure that we're ensuring affordability by subsidy as well. Our Columbus voters twice have approved bond packages to allow us to subsidize housing construction so that we can make sure that our most vulnerable and low-income families and individuals have access to affordable housing in our community. And as Jennifer mentioned, we went through a pretty robust process with the community on the zone in phase 1. And one of the things we talked about a lot was sort of what does it mean to have the single family zoning in some of our primary corridors versus allowing for some of these smaller scale apartment buildings. And when we talked with the community, we really talked about these two example corridors, primarily as single family corridors in each case. However, in the corridor A situation, we've got a zoning there on the corner proximate to the intersection that would allow for a small scale apartment building. And a lot of times when we had the conversations with the communities, those folks that were living in single family homes or preferred to live in a single family home didn't necessarily see themselves in some of the conversations we were having. And I think what we wanted to convey was how important, even if you're in a single family home in a neighborhood, how important that missing middle housing can be for your neighborhoods. Because in corridor B, we have the same condition, but the corner is strictly zoned for another single family homes. And in both cases, prior to seeing that influx of new folks, we had about a housing cost average of $200,000. And as a lot of you know, here in Central Ohio, we are welcoming Intel to our community, and the number of jobs that are coming with those kinds of investments around Central Ohio is going to bring a lot more folks into our community. So on the left, you see our new neighbors coming into our community. And in the top corridor A, you see a modest apartment building that gets built on that corner. And in the corridor B scenario, you see just those two single family homes added to the corridor. And what does that mean for change and transition on either of those corridors? And how does it impact the property values surrounding them? What we see is as those 5 people in either corridor A or corridor B situation, they're going to choose to move into this community. It's proximate to where they work, or it's got other amenities that they're interested in. In the top scenario, 3 of those folks end up opting for units in the small scale apartment building. And a couple do choose single family homes. That's going to raise the single family home prices a little bit because there is increased competition, but it's really going to be modest, which is going to help temper a lot of the property values and therefore property tax implications along those single family homes in corridor A. On corridor B, that apartment building doesn't exist. And now we see all 5 of those individuals opting to take one of those single family homes and move in there, which then ends up displacing 5 potential families from that corridor and creating that increased competition that raises those property values and therefore the property taxes as well. And then as we think about housing diversity, this is actually an example diagram that is based off the street where I live. We live in a house that was built prior to zoning, and our street really has an eclectic mix of housing options. We are close to downtown. We are close to really robust transit. It's a great opportunity area that we want to make sure has a lot of opportunities for families to live here at different income levels. And in our street, you can see there's sort of a natural diversity, not just of the housing types, but therefore the cost of housing for each of those families. Our street has row houses that are for sale, which offer a price point that you can't find in the other single family homes along in our neighborhood. And there's also apartment building options for renters that want to be close, again, to the robust transit and the employment opportunities that our street is close to. So as we looked at our zoning code, we continue to look at our zoning code in the future phases, we'll really be identifying ways in which we can diversify our housing and how do we sort of return back to the mixed income streets and the mixed income and economically diverse neighborhoods that make our city great, and ensuring that we have that high quality of life as well as the economic opportunity for our residents. And that's really the North Star that we're working towards, and using these types of tools like bringing back missing middle housing is a really important part of the strategy for us in Central Ohio as we continue to grow and add new residents into the community.
Thanks so much, Erin. I think Columbus is going to be a really amazing example to watch. But I want to highlight, in contrast to that big undertaking that Columbus is embarking on, I think it's equally important to look at how a much smaller city is also tackling some of these same issues. Okay, so Opticos had the pleasure of working on a short project for the city of Xenia earlier this year that looked at one specific area of the city that had several underutilized sites that could be reimagined for more housing opportunities. This work really started with thinking about what housing types were appropriate in Xenia, and the public engagement process got the community talking about a wide variety of opportunities that they could consider in these areas. So I'm going to hand it over to Brian to walk us through how Xenia is really incrementally taking steps to enable middle housing, starting with that comprehensive plan, to visioning like they did in the hub district here, and now thinking about what zoning changes could be made. So Brian, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you. Appreciate AARP for the opportunity to share our story today and be with all you today. As was stated earlier, Xenia is an historic, economically diverse community of about 26,000 people, about a half hour east from Dayton, Ohio. We are about an hour from each of Columbus and Cincinnati as well. We're kind of in the middle of a triangle formed by those cities. So we are, relatively small town on the edge of between rural and suburban areas. So our conversation about missing middle housing began, like Jennifer alluded to, during our comprehensive plan process, which was called Next Plan. We just completed that. Our council adopted it in June. It was roughly a 1.5-year process, and the Next Plan process was happening in the midst of a significant inflation in housing prices that was really happening all over our state and even the nation to some degree. But it was something relatively new for Xenia, which had always been a very affordable place. And also in the midst of some new economic drivers. For instance, about 20 minutes east of us, there is a Honda LG battery plant, building batteries for electric vehicles. Currently under construction. They're probably going to be fully staffed up this next year, I would guess. There's also considerable growth at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, which is about 20 minutes away, which is the largest single site employer in the state. That's affecting us. And all of this is producing increasing demand for housing. But like a lot of communities in Ohio, we are very much dominated by single family housing. And a lot of the growth that we're seeing is in single family housing. A lot of our zoning is restricted to single family housing. And historically, there has been resistance in our community to multifamily housing. The assumption from that I've heard over the years is that any multifamily housing is definitely going to be low income subsidized housing, possibly even high rises. That is something that's a picture that people have in their heads, whether it's fair or accurate or not. However, that perspective began to change during this comprehensive plan process as we started to see that housing price inflation, as new homes quickly became unattainable for a lot of current Xenia residents. That started to change the perception a little bit. In addition to that, we have a strong interest in our community in revitalizing our downtown in our older neighborhoods. And encouraging reinvestment, infill development of those areas, whether it's a vacant lot in the middle of a neighborhood or a vacant former shopping center or a vacant former industrial site. There's a lot of interest in infill development and doing what we can to encourage that and revitalize our core neighborhoods. There's also a longstanding concern that we don't have enough money to maintain our streets. And if you look at the development pattern of our community over the last 50 years, our community went through a significant boom in the 1950s and 60s. So we have miles of identical detached ranch single family houses in neighborhoods that are now not producing enough revenue to cover the maintenance of the streets. So that has sparked some conversation about, maybe a little bit of multifamily isn't such a bad thing if it brings in more tax revenue per acre, more demand for businesses, also making it easier to, again, revitalize some of these older neighborhoods. So that started to increase the appetite for increased housing density, more multi-unit construction. particularly in an infill setting. In the midst of our comprehensive plan process, as Jennifer mentioned, we focused on an area that we call the hub district. Xenia is unique in that it is we have 5 major regional bike trails that come together in a hub right in the middle of our community, just blocks from our downtown in a park. With those bike trails, you can bike to the 3 Cs of Ohio. You can bike to Dayton, Springfield, as well as a lot of other smaller communities. So it's a destination for a lot of cyclists, but it's not something that we fully take advantage of and utilize. And it is also the hub of these trails because these are all former railroads, and the park at the hub is a former rail yard. There's a lot of former industry surrounding this area, a lot of vacant properties from industries that are no longer viable. So, it's an underutilized asset in an area that has a lot of opportunity for redevelopment. So working with Opticos, who led the team in conjunction with the Congress for New Urbanism in their Legacy Community Program, the Hub District project looked at these underutilized sites surrounding the bike trail hub, looked at ways, asked the community what you would like to see for future uses. And surprisingly, there was a lot of interest in housing, which really was the best use for a lot of these sites because they were no longer viable as industrial sites. The truck access wasn't good. They were in the middle of neighborhoods in some cases. So housing just made sense. And with the help of Opticos, we helped the community visualize what middle housing could look like. Ways that multifamily can be designed that can complement the existing surrounding historic neighborhoods that we have, which, as Jennifer mentioned earlier, already have some examples of that middle housing, and help to revitalize this wonderful park and bike trail hub that we have, and create a catalyst that can drive success in our downtown, increase demand for downtown businesses, which are just a few blocks away. So the hub district planning process, which occurred in the middle of our comprehensive plan process, attracted a lot of interest and demonstrated and visualized how missing middle housing could be a solution to not just introducing missing middle housing for its own sake, but help to revitalize our older neighborhoods, serving other goals like that, helping to create a catalyst that revitalizes our downtown, providing, a greater population within walking distance that has demand for new retail, new restaurants, coffee shops, whatnot. So, and that process just helped the community visualize how that could also work in the midst of neighborhoods, is in infill sites in the middle of neighborhoods. So, a combination of all those things, we developed a significant housing became a major theme in this comprehensive plan, and we have a whole chapter dedicated to it and a strategy that focuses on taking steps to encourage infill development, including allowing more multifamily missing middle housing types that are contextually appropriate in neighborhoods. So part of that a big part of that will involve updating our zoning code, because our zoning code is one of those offenders out there that is very much focused on single family development. Very large portion of our city is zoned for that, including our older historic neighborhoods. So, there's a lot of existing middle housing that's non-conforming. So, big first step here is we are working through AARP's technical assistance program with Opticos. And what they're doing is taking a look at our zoning code and doing a diagnosis and identifying the barriers to missing middle housing and suggesting solutions that we take. So we plan within the next, I really mean I, because I'm the only city planner here, plan to, over the next year or two, make some significant changes to our code that would allow multi-unit construction in some of these infill settings in older neighborhoods, and importantly, develop design standards so that we're not just allowing multifamily, but we're allowing infill middle housing construction that enhances the neighborhood. We already, in addition to that, we already offer property tax abatements for infill development in these neighborhoods. We only offer it for infill. We don't offer it for like new subdivisions. We're also exploring tap fee waivers as another way for waiving water and sewer tap fees for new constructions within that same infill area to lower those costs. So so we are kind of in the early stages. One of the challenges that we have in talking to developers is that there aren't a lot of examples of new middle housing recently having been built in Xenia. So trying to find those comparables is a real challenge, and something that we're working to overcome. That's where we are, and look forward to the discussion.
Thanks so much, Brian and Aaron. We have been thrilled to work with both of these communities. I think they're both, what stands out to me and what really blew me away in both of these processes was the number of examples that both Columbus and Xenia have. Xenia's are more historic. Columbus has many, many great new examples. They're really doing the work. And then the other piece that stood out to me in both these processes was that the ability of both of these cities to get the right people in the room and be very, very thoughtful about the engagement. And I think what's cool about these two examples is that, like Brian said, he's a team of one city planner, right? And it really showed, and we did a process that was 3 days, right? But we had many, many robust conversations around housing and got really deep and made a lot of headway in overcoming some of these fears, but also finding out what's unique about Xenia's housing and the opportunities there, and bringing that to light was a really important part. And Brian's doing some incredible work to make that policy and then regulations align with that. And Columbus, I think we're working with Aaron at 3 or 4 different divisions made up of many, many people. And again, the city really took the lead to say this code is going to be Columbus. We want it to reflect our community and our needs. And they took the time to learn from the developments that had been built in the last couple of years, as well as the older ones, and really take that to the community and talk about why we needed zoning, right? What was the need and who would it be serving? And I think those both show great examples that you can look to in both small and big steps of ways to have this conversation and make progress to open up more of our communities for middle housing. So with that, I know we've covered a lot of ground here today. I appreciate all your time in sticking with us. So I'm going to open it up. It looks like we have several questions in the Q&A. Please keep adding them. So I'm going to, and please add them for all of us, right? All the panelists. Let me get to the first one. I'm going to stop sharing. So the first question, thanks, Amber. Does this incentive include making sure these structures are ADA, that's accessibility, compliant, making sure they're affordable and can accept those that get rental assistance, such as Section 8, and that they are built, upgraded, or restored in order to handle internet access and the like? I think this is a really great example of how complicated this process can be, but how we need to be thoughtful about all these different components that make middle housing livable. I think that's what you're really getting at. And that's why in the beginning, if you remember those 3 things, it has to be feasible to build, it has to be attainable in your market, and it has to be livable. And so I think you bring up a lot of great points. I'm not sure exactly which incentive you were questioning on. I know, for example, the pre-approved housing plans that were offered in many communities. We did a really robust pro forma analysis to understand what rents these could be achieving in the community, as well as we did a first round of building types that were 5 different building types: a duplex, the sixplex, a single family 2-story house. And the community and developers came back and said, we have seniors, we want 1-story living. So we did a small 1-story cottage, and we retrofitted we made plans for all of the building types to be ADA compliant, to have that slab on grade, right? And not have that raised, so they could be accessible. The zoning code doesn't necessarily, and probably shouldn't, state much on who can apply to the housing products in terms of rental assistance, right? But it can allow and make sure there are great policies and documents in place, like fair housing, to ensure that these can be ADA compliant, and systems and programs that ensure that it can be used for those other rental assistance programs that you have in your community. I think the second part of your question was rental housing is gaining a negative name due to many out-of-state owners who make it almost impossible to identify who they are. We know that's a big, right? Absentee landlords, things like that. And even though they're working to have, she says, in working to have the state require registration, these investors are powerful enough to stop such legislation. You're incredibly right. And the zoning, from a zoning standpoint, from a community standpoint, it's hard to stop that. What we've seen most successful is really building up that local understanding and community of developers, of small scale local developers who are working in your community and bringing these products to the table in a way that they can care about the community and protect some of those environments. We have seen, and we were working in a high tourist area of Asheville. Our hearts go out to them right now because we know, but really beautiful community. They were hit very hard recently, but had the opportunity to work there, and a very tourist minded with a lot of Airbnbs. I think that's a question coming up too. And a lot of negativity about out-of-state owners. And so they put in some code enforcement, some policies in place to try to protect those that worked alongside the middle housing ordinance. With that, in terms of rental housing and some of these programs, Erin, do you want to talk any about that in Columbus? Or Brian, feel free to jump in here before I move to the next one.
I think for Columbus, we're in this sort of tricky position right now where our rents are raising for our families in Central Ohio, but nationally, we don't really compete in terms of the extremely expensive areas. And what that's generally ended up with us is it's really hard to build new residential because of the expense on construction right now. And so where we're not much of a builder's market just yet, and we're really working to figure out what are the tools we could use to help support new construction, including the zoning code and a number of other things we've done. What we know is because of that, we're really a buyer's market right now. And the opportunity for those folks to come from out of state is something that is new for us in Central Ohio. We've had a number of folks that have come in that haven't been good partners with us, and we're responding with lots of different tools to address that, not the least of which is just making sure we have enough supply so that we aren't as attractive a market for those folks to come into. We want to make sure that we have enough supply in that case. But we're also looking at ways to deal with our code enforcement and other elements within the city to help make sure that the housing, if it is purchased even by an out of state or out of area actor, that they are still maintaining the property, making sure that it's a safe and stable place for families to live. We're working really hard with some of those folks to make sure as those new partners join us, that we have a set of expectations here in Columbus for them to adhere to.
Yeah, and I think what Columbus did really well is start to think about how the housing types that the zoning is allowing align with some of those other programs related to affordability or rental assistance and all of those things, making sure that you're thinking about how those things work together. And I think just the example in South Bend is great of building this community that understands a little bit more into that black box of development and understanding what are some of the implications and the cost to developers, and building that community that can step up against those bigger investors and say, no, this is a grassroots, we want this type of development here, and putting those regulations that can sort of protect that. The next one was a question from Sue. Thank you. On how much of your residential housing was lost to Airbnbs. Did you incorporate any changes to bring those units back to families in single person dwellings? I think this is a great question. It comes up a lot. Airbnbs can be a great tool for some homeowners, for sure, and they can be done really well, but we know there's issues because they take those housing units off the market, and that can be a real concern. Again, I mentioned Asheville, and there they put some protections that Airbnbs were not allowed in their residential neighborhoods. There's also communities that have sort of a list registration, and they can regulate how many or where. So those are some opportunities, but Brian or Aaron, any thoughts on how you've tackled that conversation?
I would say at this stage, Xenia is still, since we are not, we're not a tourism magnet, I would say. We do have some tourism, but we're still at the stage of where we're fairly open and encouraging Airbnbs. We haven't seen a large number of them. I think what happens a lot of times is people wanting to do Airbnbs sometimes get scared away when they find out that they have to get a building permit for it, because they're transforming their home into a business use that triggers the Ohio Building Code, commercial building code. So that scares some people away, kind of keeps the numbers down a little bit, but we're not at a point yet where we've seen that really impacting our housing supply.
I will say Xenia has some of the coolest Airbnbs and bed and breakfasts that I've ever seen. And actually those homeowners and community members came out in tenfold to the charrette and voiced the opportunity to say, we want middle housing so that we can show people how great Xenia is. We want those bikers to stay here, not down the road 60 miles. They pass through. And so I think there's ways to have a really positive conversation around it, but it is important to put to those protections. The next one is for Columbus from Catherine. Looking at Columbus housing mix on streets between Summit and North 4th, this person definitely knows has a configuration that made walkable neighborhoods. That combination is repeated in most of the pre-World War II developments. There's some amazing neighborhoods in Columbus, and it worked for decades before the 1970s. Can it repeat it in new developments? I think the answer is yes. I'll let Aaron. I was truly blown away with the amount of great new development that's happening, both in Columbus corridors and adjacent in the neighborhoods at that smaller scale. And so I think they're really great examples that y'all have to show the rest of the country. But go ahead, Aaron. What's some of your thoughts?
Just very quickly, as we think about how we get that mixed income, economically diverse neighborhoods in Columbus, allowing for that diversity of housing types is really important. And what we understood when we did this first phase of zoning code update was the complexity of our code was able to be managed by our big development partners, right? They could navigate the complexity of our code and process in a way that they could hire architects and engineers to really do that. But in order to make a project work, it had to really be quite sizable. Really had to bring, 150 to 200 units into the building in order for that math to work out and to kind of overcome the complicated process we had. What we're excited about with Zone in Phase 1, and as we continue to look at it, is unlocking that opportunity for smaller scale developers, allowing those, as I showed, kind of some of those 20 unit apartment buildings or a duplex or a fourplex to be viable financially, because we've removed that process barrier. We've removed that time and money and complexity so that our smaller scale developers, which are also a more diverse pool of developers from both gender and race, are allowed to participate in our community in a way that they haven't been in the past, because overcoming that barrier is so high. We're excited to see. I think we're starting to have some of the first development proposals reach our door that under the new zoning code, and we're starting to see some of that diversity occur, which is going to be really exciting, again, to allow different types of housing, different types of opportunities for families in these neighborhoods. And I can't stress enough how important our new neighbors will be to supporting things like amenities and businesses in our community. That was one of the exciting conversations we had with our neighborhoods. As family types change and as things change around in the single family homes, we see less people in our communities in these older neighborhoods. Bringing back that infill will bring back those customers. It will help thriving small businesses. Those are really new neighbors that are opportunities for our communities. And a lot of times when we talk about residential, it's kind of around the negative impacts. Is it traffic? Is it parking? What does it mean really to say what is the opportunity that new neighbors bring? And I think when we have that diversity of housing types, we get more density, more residents, we'll get more different kinds of projects in our corridors. Then we start to see that outcome of quality of life in the neighborhoods really supported as well.
Yeah, that's great, Erin. The next one's also, I think, for you, Erin. Can you elaborate on how you've succeeded in getting a bond passed to subsidize housing?
Sure. So we, as the City of Columbus, have a pretty regular conversation with the voters around bonding for what we would consider traditional infrastructure. So our utility systems, roadways. We regularly go to our voters and work with them to understand what they're comfortable with on a bond package so that we can continue to maintain our infrastructure. And in 2019, Mayor Ginther really said, housing is infrastructure, and really reframing the issue around housing and making sure that we had space for our families to live, again, regardless of what your income is. If you're a social worker in our community, if you're a healthcare worker in our hospitals, that you can choose the neighborhood you want to live in. And to date, we've bonded, the voters have authorized us to up to $250 million. We've deployed about 240 million of that to date. We do an annual of about 50 million, deploying those into affordable housing projects that are income restricted and protected. That's outcomes a little over 3,000 affordable rental units that have been built with that 140 million, and about 238 affordable home ownership opportunities that are in our highest opportunity areas in Columbus.
Yeah, that's great. I think that's a good segue to the next question of Sue brought up that $1,000 a month is not always affordable for many who are just over qualifying for HUD vouchers or some other subsidy. So how do you help the people who are slightly over that income for subsidized housing but can't afford $1,000 per month rent plus utilities? Mentioning this is definitely a common area that we see for older people in the middle 70s and even older who are living on a fixed income in a market rate. And I think what Erin was saying of finding these creative tools for financing and keeping some of those housing costs down, both in capital A, what we call capital A, subsidized affordable housing, as well as all other middle income segments of the market, doing the work to understand what types of housing are going to meet that need in your community. And matching those and building those, right? And incentivizing those, just not just with subsidized or federal housing dollars, but locally. What can you do to help those costs down? Keep those costs down. In Kalamazoo, right, they built a duplex that the city covered some of the gap financing so that they could work with a local housing provider to keep those housing costs down. And so I think you have to get a little creative, but it's important to do the work to match those things up. I'm going to jump to a question from Amber, and I think Nicole, feel free to cut me off at any time. If we need to get back to these, I'm happy to keep going. But Amber asks, how competitive will middle housing be when it comes to this wave of tiny houses? Our efforts now happening in the rebuilding and assistance of middle houses for those who were hit with the recent hurricanes. Two really thoughtful questions. I think, tiny houses are one mechanism, and I think what they highlight is this need for smaller opportunities and smaller living. Tiny houses can work great in some locations. I think Xenia may, have some spots that are open for that, but I think it's important to think about, all of these housing choices and how can we provide smaller units. And so often that's what middle housing is getting at, right? Providing those smaller units. And so it doesn't have to be either or. I think in some communities, tiny homes are a great option to be thinking about. In others, like Columbus, it may be less applicable in most of their neighborhoods, and they need to be thinking more broadly, so it's just expanding those types. I think their question about rebuilding, I think middle housing is a great opportunity for rebuilding in areas that have seen natural disasters. It's a way to get housing off the ground fast. We're working with a lot of manufactured home or modular housing builders to try to, pick up the speed of delivering housing for instances like this, as well as more broadly. So I can't speak directly to a lot of those. I know in the past, there's been a lot of cottage court examples that have been able to come up online pretty quick to help folks recover and regain housing. And I think it's an important tool. And and part of the equation.
Well, I can just jump in there. Xenia, as a community that suffered from an F5 tornado in the 1970s, one of the mistakes that was made was that some of the replacement housing was built as modernist high rises right in the middle of historic 2 and 3 story neighborhoods. And so I think missing middle housing is a fantastic solution that could have prevented the issues that we're dealing with today.
Thank you, Brian. That's a great reminder. We actually had a tornado warning when we were at the charrette in Xenia, and it really did bring that up to light of, in well-intended intent opportunities to provide housing quickly, right? We sort of forgot about that form and scale and that livability of the neighborhood. And we see this a lot historically, right? That we came down and sort of plopped something that was so out of place. And we said, that'll work, right? It's a 1-for-1 replacement, but people love their front porch and their neighborhood and their small yard. And so, we want to think about how we can offer those attributes and benefits to more people, even if they can't afford a single family unit. I'll jump to the next question of, do you have examples of small home cottages built 500 to 600 square feet? Was this successful for retired individuals? If not, why not? If yes, what causes you conclude it was successful? I think one of the interesting things when we've done cottage courts examples, so like the community, there's one in South Bend, there's one in California, we've recently done one in Athens, Georgia, right, that have these anywhere from 500 to 800 square foot units. And when we look at cottage courts across the country that have been delivered, the number one audience for them are actually single older women. And I think and those seniors, right, who are looking for that 1-story living. And I think it's a really compelling example of how these meet the needs of providing that community, that individual space, and that smaller house, and delivering, price points that are more attainable to those single person households or even 2-person households, as well as starter homes. And so I think we've seen the success that they can start to lower those entry price points, which is really important. So I think we are out of time and got through most of our questions. Sorry if we didn't get to one or two. Aaron or Brian, any closing thoughts before I turn it back over to Nicole?
Just that one of the things that I should have mentioned more clearly is that being an aging community was a big part of our conversation as well, and that has come up in some of the questions. All communities are aging, but in Xenia's case, we're aging rapidly, and there's definitely a need for more housing types, and we have a lot of people aging in place in 1970s ranch homes with yards to mow, and it doesn't work for them. They need other options.
Yeah, I think go ahead, Aaron. That's great.
Oh, I was just going to double down on where Brian was heading in that, I talk a lot when I present to communities. My mom lives in a 1960s subdivision, and it's entirely single family homes, just like hers. And when we all left the house and she became an empty nester, she really would have liked to have downsized. But for her, the choice was then she had to leave her neighborhood. She had to leave her friends, her social network, in order to achieve that smaller scale house. And so we're 25 years later, and she's still in that single family home. It doesn't work well for her. It's not something that she would pick at this point in her life, but the options were limited. And I think had there been that missing middle option in her community, it would have been really advantageous for her in that aging in place conversation. And I think that's where that diversity of housing types and allowing people to respond where they are in their life trajectory really is important as we think about how we build community and how we build neighborhoods. It really would have been a great option for my mom to stay, but be able to be in a house that fit better for where she was in her life. And I think that's what missing middle is, the opportunity for our communities, I think is really important.
I think that's a great note to wrap up on. I know someone had asked about age in place, and I think that's what this is. I think middle housing should be one tool of many in your toolbox, but it's really not limited to rental or homeownership, right? It covers a broad basis. It's not limited to nonprofit or for-profit developers. it's really a tool that can align with many of these needs, and fit some of those shifts in our communities that are really important to fill. So with that, I'll turn it over to Nicole. Really appreciate all your time and being with us here today. Nicole, I'll let you wrap us up.
Thank you. Thank you, Jennifer, Aaron, and Brian, so much. That was a wealth of information. I'm sure it was very helpful to communities across Ohio and help them explore ways to expand their housing choices to accommodate the changing demographics that they have in their community. It's been a pleasure having you all here today. Thanks for hanging on with us. And thanks again for sharing your experience and knowledge with us. While we are nearing the conclusion of our webinar, before we close, I'd like to highlight another way to engage with AARP. AARP is local. We're offering meaningful connections and enriching experiences close to home. So to find AARP events near you, you can visit aarp.org/local. That's aarp.org/local, and we'll put that link in the chat. In a few minutes, you'll receive an email, or you may have already received it, but you'll receive an email asking you to complete a survey and to help us continually improve our offerings. In that same email, you'll see a link to AARP's All About Missing Middle Housing site. There you can download the free resources we've talked about today, and we'll again put that link in the chat for you. It's been a pleasure being with you today. Thank you for joining us. We hope to see you at another AARP offering. Goodbye.